If you haven't been here, or if you weren't here last week, we are still in the Gospel of John. We're in chapter 10, and we're closing out the chapter, verses 22 to 42. And before I begin, I'll just pray for us. Let me open us up in a word of prayer. God, we're just so thankful for this place you've given us to just gather together and to be able to see each other, Lord, to converse with each other, to catch up, and just to practice being in each other's presence as we continue to just hear from you, Lord, as we continue to share about our lives and what we're doing, God. Would you bless this time? Would you bless everyone here? We pray in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so we are closing out chapter 10, and we are coming to a close in our first half of John. I think we're finishing in February, so we're pretty close to the first half of the gospel. And this section begins, so it ends chapter 10, but it kind of begins the final parts of Jesus' public ministry before he goes on his journey to the cross. So it's actually very fitting because today's passage takes place in what the Bible will say the Festival of Dedications, but what is now known as Hanukkah. And this year, Hanukkah actually lands on today. So it's pretty coincidental that today's passage coincides with the date. So I just thought, why don't we talk about Hanukkah a little bit? Because I didn't really know much about it. So in Hanukkah, you guys might know some of the rituals that they do is they light the candles, right? And there are actually two different kinds of menorahs. So the little candles with the different branches, there are two kinds. I didn't know this. So the original menorah only has 7 branches, and God actually gave the Israelites specific instructions on how to build this menorah. And it was supposed to be, it's in Exodus 25, verse 31 to 37. You can check it out, but it's very detailed, where God tells you have to build it out of just one big piece of gold. I think if you measure how much that gold is in today's money, it's like 2.5 million worth. And so the whole thing was supposed to be made out of just one piece of gold. And it has all these little details of like, you're supposed to have apple fruits in there, the lamps are supposed to be shaped in a certain way. So it's very detailed. But the Bible doesn't give too much of why it's made that way. Like, why did God choose to use apples or almond tree or almond fruit or something like that? And a lot of people will give different interpretations. If you talk to Jewish people, they'll have their own different interpretations. But for whatever reason, God doesn't give us the specific reasons as to why he designed it that way. But originally, this menorah or this candles lamp was supposed to be lit from night to day. And the idea is that God is with you throughout the night. That God is that light on the candle, and even though it's dark in the world, God is that light on that candle. So the priests were, every night we're supposed to go to the tabernacle, and they're supposed to light the candle from evening to morning. And they used, instead of candles, which is what we typically see in our nowadays, they used olive oil, pure olive oil, and that's what burned throughout the night. And the crazy thing is, whenever the priest went back to like take care of the lamp, that middle candle or that middle lamp was always lit. Miraculously, no matter what, that was the only lamp that was always lit. So that idea was that God is always with them, and they always use that lamp to light the rest of the branches. But now, there's a different menorah where you use it for specifically Hanukkah, and this one has 9 branches. And so the reason behind this one, the Festival of Dedication, Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, is not one of the feasts that God had ordained, because like the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Pentecost, those are all things God had led the people to celebrate. The Feast of Dedications was one that the Jewish people decided to do, because in the history of the Jewish people, there was a period when the Syrian nation had taken over the Jews. And so what the Syrian king did was he came and he took over the temple, and he burned sacrifices to their pagan gods. And so basically they defiled the temple. And so the Jewish people, obviously, they didn't like that, because they just came in and they took over their entire culture. So there's a group of Jewish people led by Judah Maccabee. You might have maybe heard this in history, but they led the Maccabees revolt. And so they came back, they fought against Syrian, they threw him out of the temple, and they were able to reclaim the temple. And so because they believed that God had given them the temple back. They rededicated this temple to God, and that's how they started the Feast of Dedication. But the story is, the reason why there's 9 branches, again, the middle one is supposed to be the one that you use to light the other 8, and the reason why there's 8 branches, 4 on each side, is because when they came back into the temple, because they had ransacked the temple and they took everything, they could only find 1 jar of olive oil to light the lamp. And that should have only lasted 1 day, but somehow miraculously it lasted 8 days. And so they started that tradition of lighting 1 candle each day for 8 days, and that's what we kind of know as Hanukkah. So that's the festival, again, which coincidentally starts today. And that's kind of the beginning of the story, is that we heard how Jesus healed the blind man, and then the Pharisees were after him. He's like, how can you heal someone on the Sabbath? And then Jesus goes in and he teaches them that, oh, if you're not my sheep, you're not going to recognize me. And he does the whole shepherd metaphor. And then maybe a few days later or a few weeks later, we're here in winter during this festival, and Jesus is in the temple. And there's already all this rumor around who Jesus is and what he's done, and all the opinions have already been formed. And so the Jewish people come again to Jesus, and they do the same thing where they try to accuse him. They try to find something to find him guilty of, so that they can ultimately kill him, right? And so Jesus comes into the temple, and he knows it's Hanukkah. He's there for a reason, and he's trying to show them that I am the representation of what this festival represents. Because again, the festival was about them celebrating one Judah Maccabeus, or he's also known as Judah the Hammer, because he led the revolution against the Syrians. And so they were basically also, in one way, they had statues of him because he had freed them, he had brought the temple back to them, so they were celebrating him, and also at the same time they were celebrating how God had delivered them, how God had redeemed them from the Syrian nation. And so Jesus came in and he's telling them, like, I am the fulfillment of all these things. Even though you have this human hero, even though God had redeemed you from these human enemies, I am here to forever free you. Right? That's Jesus' message. So that's why he comes during the festival, to give this very specific message. And actually, that's like what Jesus is trying to say the entire journey. Right? His entire journey is to show the Pharisees that I am the fulfillment of the law. The issue with the Pharisees was they were so strict on the law. They're always like, if you don't follow this rule, or if you don't do it this way, or if you don't do this on this day, you're doing it wrong, you're going to be condemned, and you're a sinner. The reason why you have misfortune in your life is because you don't follow these laws. They're all about the law. And Jesus came to tell them, no, I am the fulfillment of the law. I came to give you a new way of worship. And so that just kind of got me thinking, they saw all of Jesus' miracles. Like, we're believers, but we haven't had the chance to actually see Jesus do some of the things the Pharisees actually saw and do. He literally made a blind man who was born blind see. And it's like, why is it that the Pharisees couldn't believe in Jesus, even though they had a first encounter, an eyewitness encounter with Jesus? And so I kind of went through and I looked at, like, okay, what are the differences? Because there are plenty of other stories where other people Jesus had encountered, they believed them, but yet the Pharisees, who know so much about God and God's law and who the Messiah was supposed to be, they couldn't believe Jesus. Right? And the reason why I kind of wanted you guys to talk about a little bit about your disappointments, and if you guys had any. I think movie is one of probably the easiest things to go to be disappointed by a movie. And so I think to be honest, when I watch movies, I'm not super opinionated. Like, people will come out, like, oh, that was such a good movie, blah, 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 or this was such a bad movie. I just come out, like, oh, that was okay, I guess. And I think the reason why is I tend to go into a lot of things, not just in movies, but I try to not have any expectations or low expectations. Or, I don't know if you guys saw Spider-Man No Way Home, right, the most recent one. But there's this scene where MJ, the character's in that place, and she says this line to Peter Parker. Where did I put it? She said, if you expect disappointment, you can never really be disappointed, right? And when I heard that, I was like, oh, yes, that's me. I was like connecting with her. I was like, she really understands me. And so that's a little bit like how I go about like things. And so when you do that, you never really you don't have big expectations out of anything. And so you're just like, if it's not that great, you're just like, oh, it's okay. You never expected anything out of it. Although one thing I am very opinionated about is Star Wars. I don't know if you guys have seen the sequel, right? There's a lot of hate around it. At the end of the day, when you're a Star Wars fan, you're just gonna like it regardless because you're a Star Wars fan. But it just hurts a little bit what they did to the sequel. And the reason why a lot of fans, if you haven't watched it, if you're not a big Star Wars fan, the reason why fans didn't like what J.J. Abrams did with the sequel was because he kind of took the essence out of what Star Wars was. Like all of the characters, a lot of the plot, a lot of the things, like the development was not how the original Star Wars was like. They put a lot of like romance that wasn't really in the original Star Wars. These character developments, these lines that they say, it's like so cheesy and like, no, this is not what Star Wars is like. And so a lot of fans were very disappointed because there's this expectation of like, okay, this is what George Lucas set up, right? This is the story he wrote, and here are these new writers and directors who don't know what they're doing, to be honest. And they just did their own thing because they thought this is what the mass wanted. I think one of the writers, he came out to the media and he said like, oh, if half the audience didn't like the movie and half the audience really liked the movie, I did a good job. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, why would you want that? I think his idea was like, if he can get opinions out of the movie, then he was doing a good job. But why would you not want everyone to like it? But anyways, I don't know what you guys shared, but oftentimes we are disappointed because of the expectations we have of things, right? And I think that's what the Pharisees were struggling with. Is they had this expectation of who the Messiah was supposed to be, and when Jesus came, born out of a manger, out of Galilee, because they always say no one good comes out of Galilee, they're like, there's no way this guy can be the Messiah, right? They had these very specific things they thought the Messiah was going to do. Because if you look, I don't really have any slides, but there's all stories we already talked about, so I'll just kind of go through them really quickly. But some of the group of people that saw Jesus and were able to believe him, the first people were like Andrew, Simon, who were brothers. So Andrew first saw Jesus, and then he invited his brother Simon. He was like, hey, look, this is the Messiah. And then same thing with Philip and Nathaniel, their brothers, and same thing happened, where when they saw Jesus, they were just immediately able to be like, that's the Messiah. And they just followed him, right? And I think what they had, and the reason why they were able to just be on board with the Messiah, was they were just open. Because they weren't Pharisees. They weren't so caught up in the law. They were just everyday Jews who knew about all these prophecies, who knew about what God had done in their history. And they knew the Messiah was coming. And so they were just so open to receive who the Messiah might be. So maybe they didn't believe Jesus yet, but because they heard he might be the Messiah, they were open to it. So they just followed him. They were like, oh, let's go check out. Is he really the Messiah? What can he do? And even from the moment where Jesus told Nathaniel, I saw you under the fig tree. Right? Nathaniel was like, whoa, how did you know I was there? And he just immediately started following Jesus. Another person is the Samaritan woman, right? Where Jesus comes to the well. The Samaritan's already skeptical of Jesus because she knows he's a Jew, and Samaritans don't mix with the Jews. And so she's skeptical of him, regardless of whether she knew he was the Messiah. But Jesus came and he revealed to her like, hey, I know who you are. I know you have all these sins, and yet I'm coming here to ask you, would you draw water for me? And for her, that was a moment of safety, right? Even though all these people, maybe in her family or in her friend group or in her community, they all shunned her because her sins as an adulterer who had like 5 husbands, right? Jesus was able to approach her as a Jew and still ask her for water. So in that, she felt safety, and she was able to go back to her community and do it and spread like this is the Messiah. Another person is the royal official. In that scene, he's a royal official. He's a government person. There's no way he would follow Jesus, who was technically supposed to be against the government, right? Because he came to free everybody. But yet this royal official was so desperate to save his son, He had tried all the medicine he could because he had money. His last option was Jesus, and so he had no choice but to believe Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He complains. He says, will you not believe me unless I show you signs? Right? But he still does the miracle, and he saves his son. When he goes back, he asks, when was my son saved? And then his servants were like, it was at this time. And the royal official was like, that was exactly when Jesus said he will be saved. And he started believing. And there's a lot more, like the lame man who woke up, who stood up as soon as Jesus said stand up. He just believed him and he stood up. And there's that a little bit of contradiction or debate. It's like, was the man healed as soon as he chose to stand up, or was he healed before and then he stood up? Like, but it doesn't matter, because it's the same situation with that lame man, like, had nowhere else to go to. Right? There's all these people who were trying to get to the pool of Bethesda, and he had no way of getting into there, but Jesus just told him to stand up, and he was healed. Same thing with the blind man. So there's all these people who encountered Jesus, saw the same miracles the Pharisees did, because they didn't have these expectations out of Jesus. They were just so open to who he could be. They were able to believe him when he did perform the miracle. So the question comes down to us and in our moments of unbelief. What were our expectations about who Jesus was? Because, belief doesn't always have to be like, is Jesus real or not? Because if you've been a Christian for X amount of years, there comes to points where it's not so much the general idea of Jesus being real, but it's these little moments of like when you become afraid of something. Where if Jesus was real for you, then you have no reason to be afraid, but yet we still struggle with fear, right? Or anxiety about the future. If Jesus is real, why are you so afraid of what the future will hold? Because Jesus promises you everything will work out for your good. And so I just kind of want to turn that question to our hearts and ask, where were these expectations that surrounded those moments of lack of belief in Jesus? So I think the answer is when your expectation isn't built off of the original creator, right? Like in the case of Star Wars, if you don't, all the fans were disappointed because their expectations were built off what George Lucas had built. And so when someone else came over and they didn't do what George Lucas did, you should be disappointed. It's not the original thing. I think it's the same thing with Jesus, where these Pharisees have gone hundreds of years building law in their own logic. Everything made sense to them. And they have built all these cultural traditions, rituals, and expectations of who the Messiah was supposed to be. And really, one of the biggest things was that they expected the Messiah to free them from the Roman government. And that was a very circumstantial expectation. Where the Bible says the Messiah will come and rescue his people and redeem them, the Pharisees had turned that around and said, oh, the Messiah is going to come and free us from the Roman government, because they were the oppressors of the time. But Jesus came to tell them, no, there's something greater at work, bigger than the Roman government, that I'm trying to free you from. And for the Pharisees, it was really, he was trying to free them from the law. Because they were actually slaves to the law. Because their day-to-day activities, their motivations, the reason why they did anything was because of the law. And it makes sense, because they devoted their life to studying the law. But at the end, it doesn't really matter if it isn't from who created the Savior, right? The Father. The idea of this whole story of why Jesus needed to come. Have they put their expectations on God? Have they always been turning to God and asking, God, is this what you're going to do in our future, in our life? Maybe they might have been so open to Jesus. Maybe they would have been the first people to acknowledge Jesus, because they know so much. Right? But because they were always turning inward, using their own logic, oh, this makes sense. This governs us. This keeps us safe. They had built this idea. Jesus, the Messiah, is going to save us from the Romans. When Jesus came in rags, he wasn't rich. He didn't have a lot of power. He was born out of manger. He didn't fit any of their criteria, and there's no way they were going to believe him. Didn't matter how many miracles he did. He didn't fit their expectations. And so there's no way they were going to believe him. So here's kind of the main portion of this passage. It's in verse 37 to 38. And so Jesus knows the Pharisees aren't going to listen to him, but he just does what he does. He just speaks the truth, because that's what Jesus does. And so at the end, as Pharisees were about to stone him, right? They're picking up stones because they're like, "Oh, you claimed you're God. We're going to stone you. Like, how can you say this against our God? We know who God is, and you clearly are not God. So you have to die." So this is Jesus' response to them. Verse 37, it says, "Do not believe me unless I do the works of my Father. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I am the Father." So even Jesus says, he's not there trying to convince them that, "Oh, no, I am the real deal. You have to believe me." No, he actually says, like, "Yeah, no, it's okay. I know it's hard to believe someone like me who came out of nowhere." Jesus understands their situation, and he actually tells them, "Hey, no, believe in my works. Believe in the things I did, because those are more tangible. Stop focusing on my identity so much, but look at all these things that I actually did while I was here." And I think that's the message for us. Again, the idea is like, you have to look to who the Father is, right? The Creator, the one that intended for this story of redemption to happen. Because if you remove the origin out of the thing you're trying to believe in, there's no way you're going to meet that expectation. Because you're going to just be in your own logic. You're going to be making up your own reasons. And of course, there's no way you're going to believe it. Right? And often this is like what happens in relationships too. With friends, your family, right? You start building these expectations because of lack of communication, and you expect certain things. But they are never going to be able to do that in the first place. And the longer you go without communicating, the longer you go without talking to God about who He really is, what He's really trying to do, you're going to start building these, "God, you're going to do this in my life. I'm going to expect you to provide this. You're going to answer this prayer." But maybe God never meant you for you to go in that direction. So there's only one point for today. Today's sermon is really just look at the things God has already done in your life. Now, God isn't so cruel to be like, "No, you just have to believe me. I'm not going to give you much." No, He gives us tangible things. Like the reason you were able to come to church today, there's a lot of miracles that happened for you to be able to be here. So I'm actually just going to close there and just give you that time. Just sit there. Just kind of dwell. It's a big thing to think about your expectation. That's a really big thing to work out inside your heart. Because for some of us, we have gone a long time living a certain way, believing in certain things. I was like that. I think I've shared it a couple times where, I was going to church really early, and I was able to accept Jesus at a really early age. And I remember, I don't even know what the pastor's name was. She was a female. I remember it was at our old location in that building. She was giving the sermon about, "Oh, God has this plan for you. He's going to want you to drive this car, go to this school, and have this job." And I took that like word for word. And I went all throughout high school praying every day, "God, give me my specific plan. Like, what college do you want me to go to? What car do you want me to drive? What job do you want me to have?" And God never answered that, because that's not really how God works. He doesn't care so much about worldly things, but I believed that He would give me something like that. So I had built this expectation that God is going to give me all these answers. When I hit college, and I got into school, like the lowest school on my list, I didn't want to be there, and I tried to get out as fast as I can, and that didn't work out, and everything was falling apart. I turned to God and said, "God, why didn't you help me out?" In the end, it wasn't so much God not doing anything for me, but it was these expectations that I had built over years. And I had started blaming God because He didn't meet my expectations, when in reality, He had a different plan for me. And so it's big work. Like, I was able to understand that because I've been searching my heart for this whole semester while I was at school. And so it's a big task, but it has to start somewhere. So if you guys would you can close your eyes. Some of you guys might know I don't close my eyes, or I don't pray with my eyes closed all the time. So no offense, it's okay. You don't have to pray with your eyes closed all the time. But whatever puts you in that space of just sitting with God, a place where you can just kind of go into your heart. Just kind of think about, what are the areas in my life right now? Maybe for some of you, maybe it is just not being able to believe Jesus, because it happens. I have seasons where I'm like, Jesus, are you even real? Like, if I look at myself on an external perspective, like I come to church every Sunday and I do all these stuff. I wonder what people think of me, right? And you start to think like, did I just do all this just for no reason? Right? It happens. Or maybe it's just in specific areas where there's this one thing that whenever you get triggered in that area, whether it's fear, anxiety, worry, whatever it might be, anger, you definitely don't show Jesus. Or you're definitely not in a reflection of Jesus, right? So go to those places in your heart. You don't have to try to unravel everything right now. Again, it's a really big task. But just start the process of just going in and just asking Jesus. Jesus, we need you. That even in trying to believe you, I can't even do that on my own. That even though you call us to have faith, and that we're saved through your grace, so the faith that we can have, we need you to help us to have faith.